Okay, we're going to start right in. So today we're going to talk about something that most people would rather not talk about. Who in our society isn't smart enough? What do we value? Are you sharp? Are you bright? Are you with it? Are you intelligent? And what if, by the standards we have, you're not? So this is the topic of intellectual disability. If you want to talk about stigma, this is where you land. Mental illness is pretty tough. You're not rational. You're out of control. You're psychotic. But what if you're branded with a condition that makes you simply not productive, not able to do well in school or to be a good partner in a relationship because you're just not smart? So this is what the topic is. Throughout history, people with intellectual disabilities have been incredibly dehumanized, either killed or banished to institutions or living out in the countryside, because what makes us humans different from the other species? Our reason, our capacity for intelligence. And if you don't have that, that's probably the ultimate stigma. So we could look today at what society does. There's community residences. We've closed most of the state hospitals and the state institutes. They used to be called state institutes for the feeble-minded. That was the medical term. State schools for the mentally retarded. So there are better community supports, but where do a lot of people with not really strong IQs live? Also on the streets, or also with their families, with the families not sure if the person will ever be independent and without really any chance for employment or income coming in, so it's really marginalized. So what's the definition? For most of psychological and psychiatric history, the definition of being, quote, mentally retarded, which we today call having intellectual disability, is your IQ's not very high. IQ forms a really good bell curve. Mean of 100, you go a standard deviation up, 115, 2, 130, 2 2/3, 140, the upper 1% of the population. That's what you have to get into Mensa. Get a psychologist, pay them a lot of money, give you a one-on-one IQ test, and if you're over 140, you're in Mensa because you're a genius. But what if you're in the other direction? 1 standard deviation below, 85. 2 standard deviations below, 70, cutting off the bottom 2.5% or so of the population. So for a long time, that's how you got classified as mentally retarded or intellectually disabled. Your IQ is low. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, there may be several. Number one, as we'll talk about in a minute, maybe IQ tests aren't very good measures of how smart you are. Number two, what else? Maybe if you never really went to school, or you're not a very good test taker, or your family didn't have resources, you wouldn't score very high on an IQ test, but you could make it. You could read restaurant signs and menus and where the men's and women's room would be and street signs, and you could take care of yourself and cook a simple meal and go shopping. So in the last 25 years, the AAMR, the American Association of Mental Retardation, which has since changed its name, said, look, if we're going to define a group of people who really can't make it in society because of intellectual problems, IQ tests are suspicious. We have to give measures of how the person actually behaves in the community. Can they communicate adequately, verbally? Can they take care of themselves? Can they cook a simple meal without burning the place down? Can they basically get along with other people? Maybe not the capacity for terrific close relationships, but some. Can they make use of, again, a bus, get to a place of work if it's sort of sheltered employment, survival sight words even though you may not be reading novels? Again, can you get to work? Can you do a basic job? Use leisure time well? So today, if you are interested in getting a family member some services because of intellectual disability, an IQ test is part of the picture, but even more important are adaptive functioning scales. So you and the person who might be the teacher or the supervisor at the workplace would fill out scales to really appraise how well the person in these various areas can function in the day-to-day world. So the definition most places these days is you've got to have a low IQ score and these poor adaptive skills. And in some jurisdictions and for some circumstances, it's only the adaptive skills, not the IQ test, because that's really the acid test. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's how we're going to tell if you really can make it, regardless of how you score on a fancy long IQ test. So what's the reason again? Maybe the tests are somewhat not very valid and biased. Maybe people don't score well, but they actually can hang in there in society. What's the group of people who tend to not do very well on IQ tests? Well, as we'll talk about in just a short time, they tend to have a lot of risk factors for behavioral and intellectual and academic problems. Are IQ tests biased? That's the sort of second part of this problem. Well, what does bias mean? Bias technically means that if you score below a certain point on a test, well, let's talk about the lack of bias. If you score low on a test, but you actually can't perform the skills that the test is designed to measure, that's not bias, that's accurate prediction. So you could say, well, a person scores really low on IQ and that they don't do very well in school. Someone could say, well, that's what an IQ test was designed to do. What did Binet do in Paris in the early 1900s? He was given the job of predicting who wouldn't do well in Parisian schools. So he designed a test called the Stanford Binet, because Stanford started to work on this in the teens and 20s, to predict who might need special education. And you could say, well, gee, a kid doesn't do well on that test, that's biased. But if the kid actually can't do well in school, that's what the test was designed to do. But what if you score low on the test, but you actually can perform some of these skills? That's bias. It's a false prediction. So are people with risk factors for not good brain development, and they score low on these tests, is that a source of bias or is it an accurate prediction? And so this is part of the big dispute about how to define intellectual disability. So let's move ahead. Where does this really play out now? In many state Supreme Courts and the US Supreme Court. You murdered someone. You've been found guilty, and now you're on death row. What's one of the ways that would get you off of death row and just serve life imprisonment? Were you intellectually disabled? Because if you had an intellectual disability, the court system says you didn't have full capacity for premeditation. So what do the defense attorneys do? Give an IQ test. And if you score really low on the IQ test, maybe you would not be executed. But there's two big issues here. We'll talk about one of them in a second. One is, okay, I score on an IQ test 72. Now, think of the bell curve. It means 100, 1 standard deviation, 85 to 115, 2 standard deviations, 70 to 130. I have to be below 70 to be classified as intellectually disabled. But I score 72, so I'm in about the 3rd or 4th percentile. I'm not doing great intellectually compared to the rest, but I'm not in the mentally retarded, intellectually disabled range. But defense attorneys would say, is that test a perfect measure? Is it perfectly reliable? What if you gave it the next time and the person actually got a 67 or 68? So a lot of courts now, including the Supreme Court, are saying, we'll go up to 73, 74, 75, 76 within the standard error of measurement. If we were doing a big class on psychometrics, you'd know what that means. If a test isn't perfectly reliable, we've got to get a little fudge factor there. So the big dispute in many capital cases now is, what is the IQ test? And even if it's a little bit above 70, maybe the person is still intellectually disabled. So you see, in that case, you would like to get the person the diagnosis. In many other cases, you'd like to say, of course, the person's not retarded or intellectually disabled. Question? It's hard to bomb an IQ test on purpose because a valid IQ test is one-on-one with a psychologist. And it's not just a big group test like a midterm in Psych 131 where you can fall asleep or cheat or do whatever, right? Of course, you never cheat. But with a one-on-one test, the examiner is trained to get your maximum performance. Some kids with intellectual disabilities might need some systematic rewards. Now, you're not really allowed to get M&Ms after every right answer, but the psychologist is not saying, okay, let's do the clock, and you didn't fit. The psychologist will warm you up. The psychologist will kind of understand your speaking style. So, and the psychologist might say at the end of the test, this person was damn well faking it, or I don't think the person was really alert enough, and so the test would be invalidated. So, in the way that some much briefer tests, you could kind of fake that. It's pretty hard to do that on a 2-hour IQ test with a psychologist appraising not only your performance, but how hard you're trying. Okay? Question over here. Yeah, there are some maybe psychopathic criminals who really know how to play a psychologist and really know how to do a certain level on a test, but those usually aren't people who are going to be questionable in the range of intellectual disability, right? Those are going to be some of the people committing fairly heinous acts with IQs of 140. If you want to read a case about this, read the case of Gary Gilmore, the first person executed in the US in the late 70s after there were no capital executions for many years. And Norman Mailer wrote the book about him, a nonfiction novel called The Executioner's Song. And Gilmore had an IQ of at least 140, slept 8 hours a night every day of his life, never had a minute's depression, and would serially kill people in cold blood. So it wasn't an intellectual disability, it was something called psychopathic traits, which we talked about a few lectures ago. And people would be suspect of how such a person would do on tests, but not people in the intellectually disabled range. Make sense? So you can see the New York Times, Time and Newsweek, every few weeks there's another court case about should a person, well, of course the whole thing about the death penalty is it moral or immoral, but the use of IQ testing or adaptive functioning tests to determine whether people should not be executed because of intellectual disability. So here's the most important thing that I'll talk about today. If you look at the end of the bell curve, the people who score below 70, or the people who score really low on these tests of adaptive functioning, well, these people are, quote, retarded. They have intellectual disabilities. There must be some obvious biological or genetic risk factor, right? That's true in about 25% of people who meet this criterion. The other 75%, there's no brain scan or genetic test that says, oh my God, here's the reason why their test scores are so low. The vast majority of people with intellectual disability are called cultural familial retardation, or more currently, social cultural intellectual disability. These are people who score usually between 60 and 70. So they're not unable to speak. They're not in the profoundly intellectually disabled range. They're in the mild range. What happens to such people as they grow up? Well, IQ scores are fairly heritable, meaning that if your parents, both of them, have fairly low IQ scores, you're likely to get one too. And if both your parents aren't too sharp cognitively, they probably don't have good jobs if they have jobs at all. And they might have a lot of kids, and they might not know much about nutrition. And so you start to pile on bias, prejudice, poor early nutrition, overcrowded conditions. Whatever genetic risk you have is compounded by all sorts of psychosocial factors that make it really hard for you to do well on these kind of tests. Only about a quarter of people in the intellectually disabled range, usually people whose IQ scores are way low. They're below 60, they're below 55, below 50. They're down in the teens and 20s. People who never learn to speak, or people who really don't even have motor control and have physical as well as intellectual disabilities. Those are the people for whom there's about 225 currently known chromosomal or genetic abnormalities that might lead to real problems in brain development and cause certain forms of intellectual disability. But that's not most people at the end of the bell curve. So most intellectual disability is just a few IQ points lower, and you'd have had a slightly different set of genes or maybe slightly better nutrition. You might have just been over the cutoff and not been in the intellectually disabled range. Kind of a quantitative difference only. But there's a small subset, about a quarter of people at the most severe ends, for whom, yes, we'd say the medical model, the organic model really applies. So what's the most common form of genetic abnormality leading to intellectual disability? Pardon? Down syndrome. What was the old racist name for it? Mongolism. The white American and British doctors would say, the kid looks like a mongoloid, right? So Down syndrome is caused by what? There's how many chromosomes? 23. And on chromosome 21, what happens? During meiosis, when the mom is forming her ova, instead of, remember, each chromosome pair splits nicely into two, one in the egg, one in the sperm, put them back together, it doesn't disjoin, and you get an extra chromosome 21. So the formal name for Down syndrome is trisomy 21. So the child is born with one copy from dad and two from mom, has 3 rather than 2 chromosome 21s. This leads to characteristic facial features, kind of a flatter nose, broad forehead, and on average, IQ scores in the 50s and 60s when the child grows up and can take IQ tests. Some people with Down syndrome have written books and have IQs of 100. Some have IQs in the 30s. But this is a known chromosomal cause. Another is Fragile X syndrome, which leads to autistic symptoms and intellectual disability, but there's many, many others that are quite rare. What's the interesting thing in the history of our field about Down syndrome? Not only, this is not on the slides, not only do you have intellectual disability, by and large, but if you live long enough, and formerly people with Down syndrome wouldn't live very long because they had congenital heart problems, and now surgery can fix that. But if you have Down syndrome and make it to 40, what happens? Almost automatically, you develop Alzheimer's disease. So on top of your intellectual disability, you have a cognitive decline as well. So this led about 25 years ago, neurologists to say, we better start looking at chromosome 21, because that might be the source of Alzheimer's for people without Down syndrome too. And it's led to a lot of fascinating discoveries. Let's go back to IQ, because this is how we used to define intellectual disability. What do today's IQ tests measure? A lot of verbal stuff. Can you make analogies? Can you tell how two things are similar? How good your vocabulary? Gee, that's a lot of school learning too. So it turns out that half of IQ tests don't just measure some genetic trait of intelligence, they're a pretty good measure of how well you've done in school. So that's a criticism. The other part of IQ tests are mathematical and spatial, and can you put blocks that are all scrambled up to match a pattern quickly? Can you find the missing part of a picture that's got some missing segment in it? Nonverbal intelligence. So you put those two together, so performance IQ, the latter part, verbal IQ, you add them up, sum them, take the average, that's IQ. What does Howard Gardner, the developmental psychologist at Harvard, what's he said for the last 40 years? Screw that. What about the people you know who are musically extremely talented, but they're not that verbal? Or what about a really great therapist who may not, again, know the world's literature and novels or be very good at math, but has a real set of interpersonal competencies? Or people who are really spatial. So Gardner's theory says there are 9 intelligences, not just the 2 we measure on IQ tests. And we've really barked up the wrong tree by reifying IQ. Fascinating theory. If you want to read Gardner's work, it's a pretty interesting way to think about how we measure cognitive traits and what human nature is and all of that. So there may be a big problem that the IQ tests we give, again, what were they designed to do 120 years ago? Predict who needed special ed, verbal skills, mathematical spatial skills. They don't really measure a lot of the stuff that's needed for performance. Now there's something really puzzling, something called the Flynn effect. Professor Flynn is from New Zealand, and he was a clergyman, and he started doing psychology on the side and sort of self-taught and got a degree. And he said, and he did this 30 years ago, and people said, are you kidding? It's now been shown many times. People's IQ scores are rising about 2 to 3 points every decade, everywhere on Earth. IQ's going up. Why would that be? Well, maybe there's better nutrition. Or maybe there's more universal preschool around the world, of course not everywhere. So if this were true, what form of IQ would go up the most? Verbal abilities. What form of IQ is going up the most around the world? Totally nonverbal spatial analogies tests. So it can't just be education, probably not just nutrition. This is a huge puzzle. Is there something about our brains that are actually developing earlier and better? Is it something about the ways we measure IQ? But you can read big articles about the Flynn effect if you're into cognitive psychology. Well, let's go back. If the Flynn effect is real, what happens? Well, what if you had an IQ test back in 1975 and you get a certain score? And then you repeat the IQ test 10 years later, but you get a new normative sample to sort of standardize your score against. And let's say you get 100 on your test in 1975. What would your score be by 1985? 96 or 97? What would your score be by 1995? Low 90s. Score would be by 2005. Unless you've kind of kept up, if you use your old scores, because everybody's getting smarter, your old IQ score is getting lower. So if you do the calculations, most people around the time of the Civil War and Lincoln's presidency would be intellectually disabled, which is really kind of a weird way to think about it. So it's led a lot of people to think, including Flynn, what we value now on IQ tests are much more conceptual kinds of reasoning, not kind of nature reasoning. It's a long argument. But go back to the capital offenders, the murderers, right? What if you had an IQ test back when you were 20 in 1975 and you've been on death row for a long time? What are the implications for whether you get the death penalty or not? What would you want to do if you were the defense lawyer? You'd want to get the person retested now to show that their IQ was really lower than sort of falsely you'd think it was based on the 40-year-old test. So there's a big storm on death row of psychologists going in and giving modern versions of IQ tests to, quote, prove that the person is really intellectually disabled. Did you follow that? If you did, it's good, because you have to do kind of a double Norman in your head. If IQ is really going up, old IQ tests, because if you give them again and again, you'd have to renorm them, those earlier scores wouldn't be as good. So if you want to show that the person doesn't have a good IQ score, you've got to test them now with the modern norms, okay? How stable is IQ? Well, let's talk about stability. If you give a kid an IQ test now, and in another year, and in another year, and you don't just give the same test, so they just haven't learned it, correlations are pretty high. Heritability is also pretty high, as we'll talk about in a second. So the idea is we're measuring some cognitive trait, not just what the kid has learned. Question way back. Well, maybe you should go to pre-law. I mean, that's exactly right. Maybe one would say, wait a minute, the IQ now is, we found lower, but what we really need to know is the IQ at the time of the crime, because that's when the premeditation was. And then the defense would say, yeah, but those norms were wrong. And so these are why these cases take years and years. It's an excellent point. Yeah. Across the range, IQ scores are surprisingly stable. So it's not just in the low or the high end. Okay. Remember this from a few times ago? What's the heritability of IQ overall? It's pretty high, about 60%. What's the definition of heritability? The percentage of variance in a trait attributable to genetic differences across people. So the reason why some people are in Mensa and some people are intellectually disabled and most people are in the middle are a majority genetic differences, not just upbringing. But remember Turkheimer's now famous finding from 2001. There's an important moderator variable, which is called social class. So if you look at IQ scores across school districts and across tens of thousands of kids in the United States, and you divide them up, what's the heritability of IQ for the wealthiest kids? It's approaching 0.8. What's the heritability of IQ for kids near the federal poverty level? It's about 0.2 to 0.25. For the poorest kids, think of the variability. Poor nutrition, no preschool, overcrowded housing. The environmental reasons that predict variance in IQ are much greater than at the highest end where, again, how many ways can you have a TV in every room? How many ways can you go to private school? So environmental differences are very salient for IQ at the lowest ends. So the overall heritability of 0.6 is kind of a lie, because the moderator, remember the moderator, it's a variable, the different levels of which show a different relation between two other things. Heritability, the percentage of variance that genes matter, is pretty high in the highest social class and very low in the lowest social class. Again, gene-environment correlation, going back to our early principles. Let's say you've got parents who don't have very good IQ scores. They might have had parents with the same, so there's some transmission of genes. And they